Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us on today's webinar, Breaking Down the Onboarding Challenge, How Personalized Learning is the Answer. My name is Melissa, and I will be kicking things off for us today. Let's start with some brief introductions. Our presenters today are David Wentworth, Principal Learning Analyst here at Brandon Hall Group, and Manoj Kulkarni, CEO at Realizeit. I would like to extend a thank you to Realizeit for sponsoring today's webinar. Realizeit helps the world's largest organizations in all industries achieve personalized training and learning at scale to impact individual and organizational performance. Known for its award-winning learning innovation technology, Realizeit provides a first-of-its-kind learning system built on adaptive intelligence that makes learning agile, effective, efficient, and relevant to today's workplace. Brandon Hall Group has recognized Realizeit as one of the most innovative and effective technologies in both the AI and machine learning and learning management technology categories. To learn more, please visit realizeitlearning.com. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with Brandon Hall Group, we are a research and analyst firm that empowers excellence in organizations around the world through our research and tools. A quick mention that we currently have several certification programs open for enrollment, including our Certified Learning Strategist program, and you can visit certification.brandonhall.com for more information. Your participation in our surveys is one of the most crucial components of our research. So if you have a few minutes to spare and see any topics that you'd like to take a survey for, it's greatly appreciated. Links will be available in your handout, or you can always visit brandonhall.com for the latest list. All participants do receive a piece of complimentary research once the results have been analyzed. And finally, a few logistics for today. To ask questions, please use the questions panel on your control bar. Today's presentation is being recorded, and we will share a link to both the recording and a PDF of today's presentation via email in roughly 24 hours. Chat is enabled for today's webinar, so feel free to share your thoughts and chat with the others in the chat box. And without further delay, let's dive right in.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And yeah, we really look forward to seeing those questions. I see people in the chat currently saying hi to each other and to us, so I appreciate that, letting us know where you are. So feel free to use that to continue the conversation. But yeah, if you have any specific questions on something that you're seeing on a slide or something that Manoj and I are talking about, please use that question box and get those, and we'll be keeping an eye on that. We'll try to keep everybody involved in this conversation moving forward, and then we'll also spend a little time at the end catching up with any other questions or any new questions that might come in at that point. But yeah, so this is, if you haven't joined us before on a call with Realizeit, Manoj and I talk about these kinds of things a lot, and we talk about them a lot outside of these webinars as well. So, there's a lot of material, a lot of thinking behind this. And so when we talked about doing a webinar focused on the onboarding sort of part of the employee life cycle, one of the great things that we talk about is that how really organizations have to stop thinking about this idea of onboarding as this completely separate process, outside of any other sort of HCM process, outside of any other sort of learning spectrum. So, we start talking about things in that way. And as we went through, and Manoj was kind enough to sort of think through this and think through, like, okay, here are really the four key points that we should probably touch on as we walk through this, the things that we find that work well in onboarding. And we've seen the same thing in our research. So where we landed was the idea of, obviously, the first thing is we need to be providing a great experience to those employees who are being onboarded, right? I mean, especially because given the fact that by the nature of onboarding, this is one of, if not the first experience they're going to have in this kind of environment, whether it's sort of learning or coming together with the team. So that experience really does have a bit higher stakes than maybe some others, in that it has to be very engaging and enticing, so that people feel like, right out of the gate that they're enjoying this experience. And then that sort of sets the tone moving forward, right? If you have these terrible, horrible onboarding experiences, it's very hard to climb out of that hole as you move employees into other types of experiences. The second thing is making sure that we're doing a good job of engaging and motivating people to move through and to get where we want them to be. And of course, key to doing that is number 3, providing the support that they need to make that journey. You can't just leave people to themselves and hope for the best. So what does that support look like in this environment? And then, of course, the 4th key is how well are we doing in monitoring and validating that entire process? Are things happening the way we think they are? What do we do with that information once we've gathered it? You know, if we see things are working, or if we think things aren't working, what are we doing with that information? Are we turning that tracking, that measuring, are we turning that into actual insights? Are we turning it into action that we can change? So we're going to walk through each one of these a little bit in some detail and give our thoughts on it. You know, and before we kick it off, Manoj, maybe you want to just say hi, and I don't know if there's anything you want to share from the big view, or if you want to just dive right into the first element.
Yeah, thank you, David, and hello to everyone. Thank you for taking the time to be on this in this session, which David and I, as you said, are very passionate about, primarily because the research seems to indicate this being, as well as the experience, seems to indicate this being an ongoing problem that probably has exacerbated, I would say, in the last 2 years, given the nature of how, you know, businesses are changing and how the world of work is changing and how the type of workforce that's coming in is changing. So the challenges that we experience and hear, and the research indicates, is it's the same issues: the time required, how to improve the speed to competency, how to address engagement levels, which are pretty. Can you hear me? Okay.
Oh yeah.
Okay. So the engagement issues, and then the whole notion of verifying whether people are job ready or not to do that, and the pain points that we hear that are loud and clear in terms of when you talk about new employees, new hires that are coming in. It's overwhelming. There's too much, you know, for them. It sort of is a once and done. It's like a very small window of opportunity to get people to learn the kind of things that they need to do, and the support associated with it, and the choppy and the siloed experience and the lack of collaboration. These are all the issues that are surfacing in the new hire onboarding process. And, you know, there's a wide variety of organizations even represented on this particular call. So what new hire means and what you really want to get them to do can be varied in terms of where they start and where they end, and how long that duration is, and what does onboarding really mean. But at the end of the day, I think the objective is to be able to bring in this person who's so excited about coming into your organization and playing that role, and make sure that that person has been given all the opportunities in the most efficient and effective way to become job ready. You know, and the missed opportunities that is out there is, are we really missing the opportunity to let them experience the culture of investing in people, in learning and development of them, and showing them the importance of continuous lifelong learning, and having them feel supported through that process. So that, I think, is a little bit of the background in terms of why we are presenting these 4 elements, to really go deeper into each one of them, to understand what the anatomy of the problem is, and sort of what the physiology of the solution needs to be able to get to that point. So hopefully that gives a little bit of a background in terms of, you know, why these 4 start becoming important to dive deeper and discuss into it.
Yeah.
And David, a lot of this is born through your research that you know, we've talked about, that we use a lot.
Yeah. You know, it's great that we're, you know, our sort of quantitative research, our data lines up very much with what happens when we talk to companies, and then when we talk to you, and when the experience you have with your clients, you know, everything sort of lines up with where things need to move and need to go. And, you know, one of the big things that we've worked on, both of us in our own capacities over the past couple of years or so, is this idea of this personalized learning. Now, clearly, you know, your organization, this is, you know, a core element of what you guys do. In our research, it's something that we've been exploring over the past couple of years, of why it's important, how it works, what it is. And we keep driving it home, and it's because it's not as simple as just simply saying learning needs to be personalized. I mean, on its face, that sentence seems to carry enough weight that, okay, we do that, but what does that mean? How do we do that? And why? What are the elements of it that make the most sense? And so, you know, when you approach this, Manoj, what is sort of your organizations and your philosophy around what makes personalized experience?
Yeah. I think first is it's really important to kind of take stock of where we are, right? We are in a world, and we're in an age of hyper efficiency. We are in an age where work is happening all over the place in different modalities, and skills have to be developed and people have to be developed. So it's not sort of the traditional way, and this is a transformation that is happening. So there's an expectation of personalization to begin with in our lives, including our professional lives. We don't want our time wasted on things that don't mean anything to us. Or if we are, conversely, if we are spending the time on something, we want to understand the value of it. I think this is even more important to the younger generation or workforce that really wants to understand, that is driven by the whole notion of what is in it for me, to be able to make that happen. So when we talk about personalization and personalized experience, first and foremost, taking even into a new hire context, it needs to serve a purpose. And that purpose really should be around the notion of effectiveness and efficiency towards getting them to the process. Many times a new hire process tends to be a very compliance oriented process, or in many other cases, there's a huge investment being made in onboarding and training new hires to do that. The objective of that, no matter how you do it, should be, and hopefully is, to make sure that these folks that you're bringing in can be put in their jobs, they can start in their jobs and feel that they're ready to do their jobs, whether they come with experience, whether they don't come with experience. The context setting of that particular role, making sure that they feel comfortable in that, becomes really important to make that happen. So the purpose of personalization really is around making sure that you can give them a learning experience that can be tailored, that is relevant to what they need to do to become job ready, that is scaffolded and supported, and we'll talk more about that. But it's also just enough. I mean, going back to it, it's like this, I'm overwhelmed. There's too much, to do because there is a window and I need to do. So how do you just give them just enough? But in today's world, it's like there's no time to go and sit in a classroom, but at the same time, you want them to be on the floor, in the flow of work, being supported by people. So how do you make it seamless, mobile, and connected really become important? So with that in mind, I think the dimensions that really become important to consider in the design and implementation of a new hire training that has personalized becomes first and foremost. There is clarity to the learning process. This seems such an important one, some simple one to kind of say, but it's the most difficult one for people to know. It's like, well, what am I actually learning? Why am I learning? What is the structure of that learning? How do I get there? What's the journey associated with it? Can I learn in small chunks and bites associated with it? Does it really help me visualize the readiness towards my role associated with it? And then can I access it from wherever I am and be able to connect and seamlessly, whether I'm supposed to work with somebody, whether I'm supposed to learn things on my own, and maybe there's a classroom element, maybe there isn't, but how do you seamlessly connect all of that? That becomes important. Those are the important dimensions in making sure that you can personalize it, that experience. And one component that we see over and over again also in some cases is really the ability to respect prior knowledge. If I know it and I can demonstrate that I know it, can I just move along and make that happen? So those are really the high level components that become important in terms of constructing a personalized experience, probably even more important for a new hire to make that happen. Clearly, depending on the context and your environment, some pieces become more important than others. So it's not like this is an all or nothing, but it's really what pieces become important to your context. If you have a 4-week, onboarding process, then which of these components start becoming important? How much are you really orienting versus onboarding onto the job to make that happen? There are others that we see and work with that spend hundreds of hours, maybe 400 hours of training to make sure, because it's a high risk, high stakes job that people have to be put on, and you just cannot afford to put them on without having them trained and assured on that job. So those are the real components associated with personalized experience.
Yeah. And I think at the beginning there, where you tied it to sort of what people's expectations are with technology and life in general at this point, is that almost everything we do, we expect some form of this kind of experience, almost subconsciously now, that there's going to be some sort of tailoring as to what I'm doing, just based on all of our different interactions with different, apps and software and other things that we work with. And there's this confluence of things where, as technology and the internet have gone on, information, the availability of information has exploded exponentially, right? But then the ability to tailor people's experience based on the information has gotten more sophisticated as well. And that's the critical piece, because, as you mentioned, it's probably more of a priority in an onboarding environment, because people are already overwhelmed to some degree. Maybe there's people that are fish to water and they're fine, but for the most part, that onboarding experience, there's a lot going on, and the challenge is, even if they maybe aren't overwhelmed, we don't want to overwhelm them. So the extent that we can reduce the extraneous noise and information that are bombarding people, because look, it's not just the L&D aspect of onboarding that's going on. There's a lot of other aspects of onboarding that are happening at the same time. So I think your key point there, that to the degree that we can attune that experience, so we're filtering out the noise, people are getting what they need, it's so critical. And I always come back to this point that this is one of the first experiences the employee is going to have. That idea of respecting prior knowledge and giving people what they want. If the experience feels redundant or irrelevant, that in and of itself can feel overwhelming, and then doesn't set a good tone for what their experience is going to be moving forward.
Yep.
Am I going to constantly have to be wading through irrelevant or outdated or redundant material as part of my job? And so really setting up the employee for success at the outset by giving them this kind of experience. And we looked at it from a research standpoint. We asked organizations, and you'll see us come back to this a couple times here in this session. We talk about high impact learning, and from our perspective in this particular study that we ran, high impact learning, it was companies, we asked them, is your learning approach having a strong positive impact on outcomes like individual performance, employee engagement, time to productivity, which is obviously a critical metric of onboarding. And so for those companies to say, yes, our approach, whatever it may be, is having that kind of an impact, we separated those organizations out versus companies that say, no, our approach is not having a strong positive impact. And we wanted to see if they were doing things differently. And here's what we find is, from a personalization standpoint, that these high impact learning organizations more likely to provide contextualization based on what we know about learners. They provide personalized learning plans, learning recommendations based on what we know about the learners, and then giving those learners that link between the learning and their personal objectives. Again, a great sort of starting point in an onboarding environment is, here's where we want you to be, and here's how you get there. And you can just see the differences in these companies that say they do these things versus the companies that don't, and having the impact on those outcomes. So, clearly backing up a lot of the elements that Manoj just walked through, that these are the key pieces that we find are important to include.
I think one of the things that I think is important also through this research to note is that many times the words like personalization, they can have their own shades and colors and meanings of their own, right? I mean, it's very easy to kind of treat personalization such as, give people the opportunity to learn, give them a Netflix-like, Amazon Prime-like environment. It's beyond content. An experience is a holistic experience in terms of really personalizing to their success, right? Really personalizing to the success of the organization, and content is a part of it, but engagement and support, they are equally part of it. So when you look at the dimensions of personalization that become important to take a look at, and certainly you can personalize to the profile of the individual, and in the new hire, it's sort of a little bit, difficult to do that. You can certainly personalize to the context and the profile and the role, but beyond that, a big part of issues in new hire is engagement, and really ensuring that people are ready to do their jobs, to make sure that the essential knowledge and skills that they need, whether those are generic skills or whether those have to be contextualized to your environment, to the environment that they need to be working now in, that becomes important. And I think the biggest opportunity over here is that no one comes to an organization, or not many people come to an organization not excited about getting a job. The fact that they are coming to your organization excited is great. How do you sustain that excitement? How do you amplify that excitement? How do you give them the continuous confidence that it is the right organization that is invested in making them successful? That really becomes important, right?
Yeah. So there's a couple of good questions that have popped up around around this aspect of personalization. One that that Jesse touches on is the other side of this coin, or I guess the same side really, is the scale piece, right? And we talk about this a lot, Manoj, is, you know, Jesse's saying interested in making personalized learning feasible and manageable. How do you do that, you know, for X number of roles and so forth, and balance the work needed to validate prior knowledge? And I think we'll talk about this a little bit, but I think the key point of this is, a part of this is really two things. It's understanding what kind of data you can get, and getting it and using it, and having the technology to make the most of it. Really, that's where the technology comes into play, is the personalization at scale and being able to do it across large groups. But yeah, do you want to touch on the scale element a little bit?
Yeah, I think, and we deal with a lot of, I mean, my entire, for a long period of time, no matter what context I've been, it's like, if you want to make a significant impact, it has to be done at the scale, right? We can talk about these things in a very measured and narrow scope or focus associated with, but how do you do this at scale? And for some organizations, many organizations, it's going to be a journey. But I think the components that become really, really important in there is, first of all, sort of the model of learning. What is the model of learning? Secondly, it's the process. You've mentioned on data, which is absolutely important. The question really becomes, you know, are organizations ready to become data-driven and use data to be able to drive their, and the fourth piece becomes technology, right? Yeah. Anything that delivers innovation at scale requires the right kind of technology. Organizations have their LMSs, their LXPs, their LCMSs, they have all of that, and yet we hear this over and over again, which is like, we can't do it at scale. So there's something missing in there. There's, you know, and I think that really is the context of where we're talking about. It's like, how do you do personalized learning at scale? So before you do how, the question is, what is it, and what does it need to be at scale to be able to make that happen? So I understand the struggle, but that is exactly where the domain that we've been working on the model, and 100% agree that it has to be at scale. We have numerous examples of people who have done that at scale. And there are shades of getting to personalization maturity over scale as well, but it absolutely has to be, the model has to be designed at scale, the process has to be designed for scale, the data elements have to be designed for scale, and the technology has to support the scale.
And the bit about data that you brought up actually touches on something that Cindy was bringing up in the chat, was around building out this personalized info before an employee even starts. How do you do that? And you're saying, is it through a resume? Is it through a survey? And I would say yes, and assessments, whatever tools you can use, whatever you need to get whatever information you need for that particular group of people who are being onboarded. Yes, as much information as you can gather. And that means working with hiring managers. It means integrating somewhat with the talent acquisition process, whatever that may be in your organization. So you get as much information up front as possible as you can, because there's a lot of things going on with these candidates and then employees before, you know, they ever see your sort of onboarding environment. So yeah, important to include all that. So let's talk about the engagement piece. You mentioned it earlier when we were talking about personalization, which is an element in driving engagement. But you know, how do you elevate that?
Oops. Are we losing David?
I think we have Manoj.
Okay. So I think he will come back in. I think his question was around how do you elevate engagement and more. He's got the keys. Let me talk about it. In terms of the engagement, let me answer a question before that in terms of what he was talking about how do you do this stuff. is it through resumes or careers? So we can come back, hopefully, he can come back in 30 seconds. If not, then we will take over and run it. I think one of the things that we always talk about with people when they want to start on this journey is that the reality is that you have a lot of information available to you, whether it is resumes, whether it is job data, whether it is the content of orientation and onboarding that you have. There's a lot of information in there in terms of what that needs to be. And usually it may not be the best ending point for you in terms of completing the journey, but usually there's a starting point built into it. And that's typically how we start with, to say, it's not like you're bringing these people and say, just figure it out. You do have a process. You do have some model associated with it. And starting with that is usually the best. And then figuring out where the gaps are. The thing about a data-driven process is that you're never done. You're never done. You start with something, you put it out there, you see what the data tells you, you improve it, and it allows you to become surgical and tailored around how to really improve this stuff. And typically the way it starts is it starts in smaller environments for some roles that are more important, and then starts expanding, to greater roles. So if there is an expectation that all of this comes together at scale at once for people, I've seen that happen, but only in a couple of environments. But those were extremely well laid environments, like a big retail environment where if you design it for one store, then you are able to replicate it to a number of stores. And even if you choose a few roles in there and do that, you can make that happen. But that's an example where scale is a factor of multiplying a huge multiplication of a common unit associated with it. So that's an example. David is in the middle of a massive thunderstorm. So he had alerted us to that.
I can go
Melissa,
ahead and
Melissa,
share.
can you share and start where it is, and I will talk about it until David gets back. And so the thunderstorm did strike us, or strike David, and therefore us. I think we're seeing the presenter slide.
Okay,
So just switch over to. Apologies for that, folks. We should be back momentarily. I don't know if there are other questions that have come up. Excellent. Yeah, let's just work with this.
Perfect.
Awesome. Okay, so the question really was around the whole notion of engagement, and engagement is one of those things that keeps coming up. It's like, how do you keep them engaged? Whether you're doing a 4-week orientation onboarding, whether you're doing a 3-month, whether you believe that onboarding is a whole year-long activity, how do you keep people engaged? Because the thing that happens when people get overwhelmed is that they get disengaged. So Melissa, if you can just go to the next screen, please. So the engagement aspects of it that we look at in terms of how do you motivate learners to stay engaged in the process? And engagement has 3 dimensions in a learning process. I've been involved in learning for a very long period of time in both academic and non-academic environments. And the common theme in there is always around these 3 aspects of engagement. One is the cognitive aspect, making sure that they can learn and they're ready to learn and they have the cognitive dimensions to be able to learn. The second part is behavioral. Do they have the right behaviors for learning? And the third part is emotional, right? Are they in the right emotion? Are they emotionally invested in this process? And optimally, these 3 are required for people to be able to engage. So the question really becomes, in your experience, because this is really part of design as well as experience, how do you keep track of the cognitive, behavioral, and emotional aspects of learning to be able to track their progress along these? Get the continual feedback, provide them continual feedback, nudge them where they need to be nudged in terms of moving along in the process, and motivate them to be able to do that. Salespeople would love to motivate through challenges and leaderboards. Others may not be. So, but the question remains, what are the motivation pieces associated with that? Because at the end of the day, you want them to understand how to self-regulate their own learning. A big piece of this really is that you've got a bunch of new people who are coming in, they're overwhelmed in the process. You want to make sure that these folks can actually stay in there and stay engaged with the process and not disengage with you on that, and making sure that they're cognitively getting the stuff, they are behaving, displaying the right behaviors for learning, as well as you have the ability to know that from an emotional state standpoint, they're doing well, becomes really important. The last part of that is making sure that you've got the ability for them to be able to learn not only from content, but from various other sources to be able to know that. So whether it's collaborating with peers, getting a mentor, getting some coaches from people, all of those pieces become really important in making sure that people feel that they're part of a community. Collaboration becomes important today because everybody wants validation for engagement through their social networks. So to be able to establish those earlier on become really, really important for the process. So that's really is the whole notion of engaging and motivating learners. I don't know, is David back? Because I will cover his screen. His thought.
I'm here.
Okay, great. Glad to know you made it through the thunderstorm.
It was a quick, I mean, it's still, I don't even, you probably, I have to speak louder from the rain, but it was a quick power outage, but I'm back. So I appreciate everyone hanging in there. Sorry about that. But yeah, as I mentioned, earlier, it's similar to the data we shared previously. It's around this idea, okay, so what are the elements that are driving engagement? And again, going back to that data around what those high impact organizations are doing, what we've seen is that these companies are more likely to provide opportunities to actually practice and apply the knowledge that they're getting. They're more likely to provide learners with an introduction to how the program is going to go. I know that almost seems like table stakes, but you can see the difference between these companies that have a high impact versus the low impact that provide this. Just simply providing learners, hey, this is how this is going to go. Here's what you should expect. Goes a long way to creating that engagement. Also giving learners the ability to search, explore, and discover as they go through. I think that's a key point in this onboarding environment where we're giving people what they need and what they have to have in order to move forward, but also providing that ability to sort of explore and see what else is available, what else is out there, to broaden their own interests in what's going on. And that actually can turn into knowledge and data for the organization that says, look, these people we brought in, this particular person is sort of veering in this direction, is interested in these things. This person's interested in these things. That can help sort of define their future path. And then the last element on here is this idea of being able to reinforce the learning concepts. So give me an opportunity, whether it's an activity or again, going back to that practice, being able to reinforce what I'm learning. So again, bringing in elements that drive what the engagement is. And you notice a lot of these are not about what's in the content or the use of media or the colors or where the buttons are, right? Those are all important things when you're building content, but that kind of engagement doesn't happen until the person's already in the content. So we're talking about trying to build engagement around the whole concepts of onboarding, the whole program, building it ahead of time so that they're already engaged, excited, they see the relevance that, as Manoj had mentioned in the previous section, that what's in it for me, that drives a ton of engagement, right? If I understand why this is important, then I'm all in. So this just shows the different things that these companies are doing. All right, so then we brought up the third point, Manoj, when we were talking about this this doesn't happen without support and oversight, right? We can't just sort of build it, set it free and hope for the best. There has to be this ongoing support. So let's talk a little bit about what that means.
Yeah, I think I think we've touched upon it, before, but I think the part in here that's really important is that, people expect their managers to start engaging with them. Particularly with younger folks who really want feedback. They're conditioned to feedback. They're conditioned to constant feedback. And I think managers are frustrated because of the fact that for the most part, they can see people doing things, but they don't know if they really know or not. And they're missing the opportunity to actually jump in and help them support this stuff. Because for effective support, for the learner to be successful, it really needs support from all the stakeholders. So you may be having a training context or a coaching context where some of it is self-learning and some of it needs to be learned through a trainer or a coach with it. How do you seamlessly build this? How do you make sure that the trainer can actually personalize the support? So back to the stuff that we're talking about, personalization, this is not just about personalized learning, but in that context, it needs to be personalized support, personalized training, personalized coaching, and even all the way up to learning designers. And I'm sure there are a lot of folks on this call in terms of who are those designers sitting over there saying, well, how do I do this stuff? And how do I make that, really work? So what becomes really important from giving the right support is, can you get ongoing progress insights in terms of what people know? Can you understand their gaps? Can you give them feedback? Can you actually take the opportunities to coach them and therefore tailor the training and provide the timely communication? This is one of the biggest challenges associated with support. And this is the stuff that we see on an ongoing basis, that this is not just about the learner and the content. It actually is more important for those who are supporting the learner be successful, particularly in a new hire context, to make sure that they feel supported and bring them to where they need to get to that. The challenge with that is that there is, back to the data stuff that you were talking about, there isn't enough visibility in terms of what people have and they don't have. And let's not forget the fact that managers themselves are very busy and they have their own stuff to do, and they don't have the time to be able to individualize and personalize to every person. But it becomes imperative to be able to make sure that the support is given to people during this process to be able to make it effective.
Yeah. And so from a support standpoint, some of the things that we thought were relevant to that is, again, giving your learners the expected goals and outcomes of the program. Here's what we expect you to be able to do or know. And how, when you're done with this, giving them that support through there. The practice and apply knowledge methods, again, is a form of support. That ability to gather learner feedback, right? Do we have a mechanism in place to understand what's going on from the learner perspective, what's working, what isn't, what they'd like to know, do better? That's an important key to this. And then, of course, the big one, and you can see the gap here, is providing coaching and mentoring opportunities throughout the onboarding process. So critical to provide that. And again, that's an issue, again, where technology comes into play, because we do know that one of the things that makes coaching and mentoring so effective is its relative one-on-one nature, and it's difficult sometimes to scale. And so the ability to factor in some technology components to that, to sort of make sure that those coaching moments are happening at the right time and for the right reasons can help, make sure that that's a scalable approach, because we do know how critical it is. There's also some, I just want to touch on this question because it's a couple questions. Two different people touched on this that came in. Manoj, we should talk about it a little bit, because we've talked about it here a few times around social learning, the idea of, how critical that is in an onboarding environment, that people can connect with one another, because here they are, they're probably all new to the organization, so they have this thing in common. You see it in any kind of orientation, right? We're trying to get a group of people to feel connected, and they're sort of in the same boat, and so they're all connecting. And so using social learning to connect and collaborate. So the questions around are like, it's useful, but how do we keep employees engaged in it? And then it's like, and Troy has the example of, what about like a group of learners like engineers, which I think the implication there, Troy, is that they're probably less likely to be involved in social activities like that. And then Melissa also follows up on that with, yes, I also find this challenging, keeping people engaged in social learning. So for my first take on those questions and perspectives is that, it's not always going to be 100% for every single person. Everyone's going to react or behave differently in those elements. That's the nature of a social engagement, right? Is that people are going to behave how they particularly behave in that environment. So the goal is, the engagement is, show that it's useful, right? So that you try to eliminate as much of the noise in a social environment as possible, so that what's really happening in those, especially in a learning environment, what's really happening are productive interactions. And so that's by setting goals and rules of engagement from the outset. So a little bit of monitoring with the light touch goes a long way here, without putting a stranglehold on those interactions. I think that's critical, making sure you have that, but also just recognizing that not everybody is going to engage. You don't necessarily want to set a bar that says, hey, in order for you to get from point A to point B, you have to have 5 interactions on this social platform. That won't work. You're just going to disincentivize people. It's because some people don't engage that way, yet they're still going to gain the benefit of those social interactions by observing. It's a matter of incentivizing people who are good and knowledgeable about interacting to interact, and then incentivizing people who are more, if you want to call lurkers or absorbing the information, make sure that they're using it in the right way too. So it isn't like 100% fixes everything, do it this way. It's finding what works for your audience. And Troy, your audience of engineers, there's a chance, if it's used in the right way, even engineers, when they're working, say, in the same room, they're still going to ask each other how things are done. Hey, I ran into this. What do you do? What do you do here? So being able to replicate that in some way through technology is what's going to help scale this. So I just thought we should talk
Yeah,
about.
I think, look, I mean, we can always hang on these labels like social learning and stuff like that, but I think it's a couple of things, right? There could be some places where you want collaboration to happen because that's the best way for a new hire to learn in that process. And how do you make that happen? You know, is the process in there. But there are other places where you want them to start building their network and knowing who knows and how to connect with people and do that. And to your point, there'll be some who take advantage of it, and there'll be others who say, no, that's not for me, and I don't need to do that. So it's this design in there in terms of what are the mandatory pieces and when do they need to happen versus what are the opportunities for people to connect and how do you make that happen. That become really important. The reality of it is, it goes back to the thing that I keep saying over and over again that I find, right? Nobody has the time, including a new hire, to be able to do. How do you create the opportunities for them to know what they're doing? That really becomes important. So I think it's more stage setting in terms of them to be able to create the network, but then understanding where to really drive collaboration activities so they can create those opportunities to know who really needs to know. I think that's really the part of decision making in the design process.
Yeah. No, thanks for sharing that. So we can, once you want to, we'll move on to the next section here, this assessing readiness. And so this goes to the monitoring and assessing and validating the process. And so, you know, a key element as we're doing all of these things, how do we know that they're working?
Yeah, I think, and this is probably one of those pieces when we come to this stuff where everybody agrees on experience, engagement, and support, you know, but the whole notion of do we need to measure or validate learning, particularly for new hires, it really depends on the type of role and job that you have. But there are high stakes, you know, roles that we have, you know, whether they could be billable, whether they are on a ship, whether they are in a healthcare environment, and these are all, you know, places where you want to make sure that when they're onboarded, they are ready to be able to do the job. The big question comes over there saying, so how do you know? And back to the concept that you had put in your research, which is people really want to know that whatever you're telling them, they know how to apply that knowledge. But how do you know that they actually know how to do that? So being able to manage, measure, and validate their learning progress, which is not just on completion, and you know, it's really about making sure, are they really getting the knowledge and the elements that are essential for their job, which makes you the ability to measure whether they're job ready becomes important. And assessing the learning progress and assessing the acquisition of knowledge that is essential, whether through a variety of mechanisms, becomes really important. Maybe it is you know, checks and evaluations with a manager. Maybe it is an expert who's taking, and we've seen all these cases, and again, there's no prescription over here, but the big piece in here that I think I'd like to point out is that this is a missed opportunity, you know, in many new hire training scenarios, other than the ones that are high stakes, to really understand how to level set and put a stake in the ground in terms of what is their state of learning to do that. A lot of it is based on manager evaluation and manager feedback. Could be based on a mentor or a peer who's been given to them to be able to know that. The objective over here is not to know if they have all the skills. The objective is to really figure out, do you feel confident and comfortable that they can be put on the job and they're ready to be on the job? And do they feel that, you know, you've given them the stuff? Now, clearly they should know what the role is about, or they're being trained into a new role. But at the end of the day, does the organization feel like these people have been given the knowledge acquisition that they need through these onboarding processes for them to become ready to be on the job and perform?
So those are the four elements, and then sort of, I think we want to get into this idea of moving past that, because the idea is that this, you know, you'll notice a lot of these are borrowed from the larger strategies for learning and development in general. And that's the whole point, is this should be this long continuous process. It can't be completely separate. You can't give people one way of doing things through the onboarding process and then suddenly expect them that this is going to be this other whole way of doing things in a learning and developing environment. It's all the same. So let's talk about that seamless transition. And I know that there's some sort of an example you want to show of how this all comes together, but let's go through this a little bit.
Yeah, so I think quickly, the whole aspect is, you can't just look at new hire and ongoing in silos, right? At the end of the day, if you do this right, then the process of connecting them to ongoing learning becomes important. What is ongoing learning? It's about making sure that you continue to verify that they're managing and maintaining that knowledge, they're sustaining that knowledge, they're retaining it, they haven't forgotten it. When something has changed, they have the ability to, you have the ability as an organization to know that they have updated and taken in that knowledge. If something changes in terms of for the same role that they need to perform a new knowledge, to be able to give that in a very tailored fashion to be able to do that, or perhaps, down the road to be able to prepare them for the new role. But even in the role that you brought them in, the question is, how do you continue that? So in one of the discussions that we had before, somebody mentioned this notion of everboarding, right? It's not onboarding. It's like once you've onboarded, you're everboarding them. It's like you need to make sure that you spend so much time in terms of making sure that they have the knowledge to do their job. The question is, are they keeping that current? Is it maintained? Can you be assured that they still have it? And if they're not, then how do you help them understand the gaps? That really becomes a big advantage in terms of an extension of doing a model like this to be able to give that value on an ongoing basis.
And so if we move forward here, I think we wanted to get into the recap, and then, like I said, you've got something you wanted to share to show how this sort of comes together. But
yes,
yeah,
go ahead. So
yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry, it's just, again, the recap of all the things we talked about, the personalized elements, the engaging and getting a stakeholder engagement throughout the process, and then validating the process. These are good rule of thumb, not only for onboarding, but again, as you said, sort of that everboarding to keep things moving forward. So if you want to get on to the next, and then we do have some questions for folks that we'll get to after that. We saw some good ones.
Yeah, so let me quickly, because I think one of this thing that, David, I'm going to stop your sharing and I will take over mine, just so I can show it. And what I wanted to do is just give a view in terms of, so if the question is, okay, this is all great in terms of how can this all come around? So keeping these elements, the keys, and then the components in there, I just wanted to quickly run through in terms of how could that come together, in terms of what experiences have to be built to be able to make that happen. So on a learner experience, we talk about the fact that, are you giving clear job specific knowledge and progress, as opposed to doing courses and having people go through courses or read stuff? Is it really aligned towards a job or a role and the knowledge, essential knowledge, and can you track the progress associated with that? So you can give a really good learning plan associated with it. Many of the aspects of new hire have orientation, they have compliance, they have job skills training. They're all laid out in there, but how can you create a learning plan that is clearly laid out for a learner to be able to say, can you do that? And then, and this is the work that we do a lot in terms of understanding, how do you look at learner interactions and what they're doing and what they need to do, and begin to personalize those actions in terms of what are the best next effective steps for them to be able to do that. To the notion that I talked about, the fact that people, when you go on a journey where they've never gone before, invariably you're going to use a GPS to get there, because you want the most effective and the most efficient way to be able to get there. And that's really the notion of guiding people through the journey. So you know exactly what they need to do next. You can give them the agency to be able to learn on the things, but you can scaffold the learning. You don't have to do things until you've done some other things to do that. And you give them various ways of learning it, whether it is, and no matter where it happens, whether it happens in an LMS or an LXP or somewhere else or on the floor offline, but there are some self-paced activities. You can continuously embed the feedback and understand how people are feeling about that. And then you can embed these aspects of, can they learn by doing? Can you actually demonstrate the piece associated with it? Incorporate the aspects of instructor-led, e-learning, peer collaboration sessions associated with that, ultimately leading to that whole notion of validation that we talked about, which is, can you demonstrate the proficiency? So you know that they're there. But at the same time, personalize the experience in terms of somebody coming in with experience versus without experience. Can you actually help them work on the things that matter to them, or perhaps role variations for people coming in where some pieces are common and some pieces are not common? That becomes important. And back to the aspect of engagement that we talked about, can you really capture engagement at the point and really understand how to how to drive that, in terms of nudging learners to be able to perhaps reach out to a trainer or a coach to know what they're doing and understand how to help them in that process. This is the part that we've talked about before that is difficult to do at scale. But once you start applying intelligence and learning and algorithms associated with that, that's what you depend on technology and intelligent technology to be able to do that. So learners can be guided when they're not doing some things to be able to bring them to the learning, or perhaps give them the motivation and get surveys, in the moment to know how they're doing again the stuff, or perhaps reward them with badging. We all have an Apple Watch that tells us to stand, that tells us, that gives us a little badge because we've done something. And, we like that because it tells us that we're being motivated to be able to move forward. So what are the mechanisms that you can use by rewarding people for activities as well as accomplishments, leading all the way to the pieces associated with that? And for managers and for trainers, and can you really get an instrumentation and dashboard to really understand what people know and what they don't know, who's lagging, who's not lagging, who's behind, where the specific problems people are having, so they can get pinpointed. Learners and employees are a black box until, they evaluated, or worse, they've caused some issue on it. But how do you know that someone like Mark is having issues and is not feeling good about the training? Can you give those options for people to be able to articulate that stuff and know how that correlates to their learning process in terms of their progress, in terms of what they're doing? And the same goes for trainers in terms of, can they really look at their group averages and see who's doing well, who's not doing well, where people's specific gaps are to make that happen? So to be able to give these surgical tools that are enabled by data, that are enabled by intelligence, so the heavy lifting that needs to be done, which becomes an impossible task for managing at scale, now becomes, available through the whole notion of AI and machine learning and data and orchestration of data associated with it. So leaders now can feel confident that their people know what they need to know. You're trying to put somebody into a customer service role and put them on the job. Do they have all the stuff? Are there gaps associated with it? And if they have gaps, where exactly are the gaps and why are they lacking with it? And at the same time, when we talk about how do you really capture performance data, maybe you're capturing this data inside performance management systems today. Maybe it is in Salesforce. Maybe you want to observe how they're doing it and actually see their performance on the floor and bring that, but be able to bring that knowledge, assessment, assurance, and performance data into it and be able to drive these personalized learning plans becomes really, really important. And then as we talk about the onboarding piece, which is really understanding how to drive that management of knowledge and maintenance knowledge, so you can gamify the whole aspect, that in short bursts to be able to really understand and assess whether people have that or not, and understand where their gaps are so they can actually keep their learning and knowledge current to be able to make that happen. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of, I know we should be taking questions, but I wanted to at least visualize the concepts that we've talked about in terms of how can they manifest itself in terms of really bringing them to bear, to orchestrate and make this happen within organizations. So I'm going to stop my share. So I'll give it back to you. You can take it over.
Actually, Melissa, if you want to pick that up, because I don't have it open still from before, but essentially we're just at the the Q&A, and there's a couple of things here, and this will be in the deck that's going to be available to everybody. That you can download some of these resources from Realizeit to get a little bit deeper into some of these elements that we touched on. But some of the questions that came in, I mean, there's some kind of big picture questions here. I think one is tips for trainers and coaches who lead onboarding. Luke's somewhat specifically interested in leader and executive onboarding, but still open to just anything around what skills trainers and coaches should have from an onboarding perspective. And I think, some of the things that you talked about already fall into that, but anything specific for those particular facilitators or coaches?
So these people who are actually coaches and trainers for them. Okay. Yeah, I think the biggest thing for a trainer is, and we see this aspect in individualization and personalization. It's like, how do you really open the black box called, this learner that's in front of you? How do you really make that training effective? The two approaches are, I don't know, I need to just tell you what I need to tell you, and I hope that you've absorbed it and it's okay with it. So I think the model that we always, tell people is like, a discovery process in terms of where people are and what they know and what they don't know and where their gaps are, no matter how you do it, becomes absolutely important, right? That's the whole notion of what a great coach, a great teacher, a great facilitator has always done, to be able to tailor and individualize it to them. So the aspect of understanding what they have, which means that there is a common base about, so what are the essential skills that you're trying to effect in there? How do you go about trying to even understand where they are in terms of that skill? Are they okay? Or are they not okay? And if they have the specific need, how do you help them do that? There's a lot of talk about how to help people learn through different media resources associated with it. I don't think that that's that big of a problem, as opposed to really helping people understand what's really important for them to learn to become effective at their job, to do that, right? So it's a generic answer. Obviously, we can go into more details with it, but I think it's really about becoming more data-driven and really understanding how to understand that person's needs becomes really, really important.
Yeah. And it's funny, the answer to almost any of the questions that come in feature that response that you just gave there, is that at a certain point, it becomes very specific to what your organization does, or that particular business unit does within the organization, the ways in which you're going to engage your audiences. Like going back to the question about social learning, collaborative. Well, okay, that really depends on the audience. We can talk about how important and effective that kind of learning is, but how you approach it really matters on the subject matter at hand, the people that you're dealing with, and how they interact with one another. So there is no sort of do it this way, X, Y, Z, and you're done. It's take this concept and apply it in your particular venue, your arena, for your audiences. It goes for everything. And that comes down to also one of the questions that came in the chat was, okay, feedback, I get it. How, gathering learner feedback. How do you do that when the class is really large? Well, the goal is to set expectations. You level set from the outset. It says, listen, we have this many people, we're doing this session. I'm not going to be able to respond to feedback in real time. Lay that out there and say that,
yeah.
But if that's the case, in that we're going to look at the feedback and we're going to monitor a different way, if it's impossible to do, or have the technology or the support in place that allows you to take in real-time feedback and do something with it. But whatever it is, you have to set those expectations.
Yeah, I think the technology has to do the heavy lifting. I think challenges that come in is like, you have a technology and you expect to do it, and you try to tailor yourself to what the technology can do, as opposed to what the technology needs to do for you. I mean, I can tell you that we have situations where there are one person responsible for 5,000 people. And in that case, what the technology has to really help understand is, who are the people who really need help? What do they need at this point in time? How can we help them? That's the hard part. Once you know what they need and what they do, the easy part is then, or the easier part, it's not that easy, but it's the easier part of that is then saying, well, how do I help them specifically with the things that they need to learn? So I think task number one is really understanding the gaps individually to do that. And without technology and the right technology, that is not going to be possible to happen at scale. That's something that we know technology can solve that problem today.
Yeah. And I think, again, another question that's here that includes that kind of response where it's tailored. Sonia's talking about how they have a small organization. So, onboarding at scale isn't really the issue, but it's more about how do I personalize and upskill training for advancement, and what methods would be most effective. And I think, you touched on a lot of different methods, but again, it isn't, here's everything you can do these things. It's what is the combination of modalities, technologies that are going to make sense for that group.
Yeah, I mean, I use the analogy of training or, exercise, right? Does having a gym membership make you better? Does going in for 30 minutes and working out, is that, yeah, marginally it's better, but does it really help you? So unless you work backwards in terms of what your objectives are and, what the needs are, and how do you start tailoring that, you really, from an effectiveness perspective, it's a hit or miss. And that's what we tell people. It's like, you're investing in learning and training because you want to make these people perform in their jobs. That's really what's important. So linking it to performance becomes absolutely important, and then working backwards from the job and the need and the role and the performance thresholds, and then understanding the learning gaps that are necessary towards that really becomes important to do that, right? If you don't do that and you're just looking at courses and saying, are they using the courses? It's hard to know how to make that linkage.
Yeah. And I'm going to use a word that you've used a lot when we talked, is this idea of completeness, to touch on what you're talking about there. And that idea, and your example from the flow chart that you had earlier was around hand washing, which it strikes with me because that was for kitchen safety. But I look at that as it's a huge challenge in healthcare. And it's something that we hear from healthcare training professionals all the time. Is one of our biggest challenges is training on hand sanitization. And it's mind-boggling to think that it's such an issue, but it's one of the number one issues. And the reason why you start with that business need is there's this reinfection challenge in hospitals. And one of the drivers of that is his poor hand washing. So
I think we might have lost David again.
Well, Melissa, that's a sign. I think he turns off at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock. Well, I know we're at the hour, so I just want to take the opportunity to thank everyone for being in this. Clearly, this is a big topic. We know that there are lots of perspectives. We have lots of questions. We'll put up the information. So obviously, David is available for more detailed conversations. We are available for more detailed conversations in terms of how that needs to happen. There's a difference between accepting the philosophy and building a solution. And certainly we can, have deeper conversations as your interest surfaces, to be able to understand how to build these solutions that are specific to your context as well. So I don't know if you want to close, Melissa, but I wanted to at least take the opportunity to thank everyone for being on this and having what seems to be a very robust conversation in the chat as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Manoj. And thank you to Realizeit for lending us the hour today. Thank you to David as well for co-presenting on such an interesting topic. And I will just flash one last slide up here. Of course, we invite you to join us on any other upcoming webinars. And we have an entire library of on-demand webinars that you can also peruse through. And until next time, we will see you on another webinar.
Thank you very much.